Hi, my name is Brad DeRoche, and I'm excited to present to you a series called From the Practice Studio. In this series, we're going to explore a wide variety of topics, ranging from guitar technique to expression and so on. These are tips and techniques that I've learned along the way from many years of practicing and teaching guitar. So please join me with each episode as we explore this absolutely beautiful instrument, the classical guitar. In today's episode of From the Practice Studio, we're going to explore dynamics. Dynamics are changes in volume on our instrument, from loud to soft and in between. Now, most of us do practice dynamics in some way, shape, or form, but what I've come up with is a way to categorize or catalog the different types of dynamics that we do use and to practice them in three very distinct ways. So let's jump right in. To begin with, the technique of dynamics on the instrument involves displacing the string or moving the string more or less. The more we move it, the louder the sound, the less we move it, the quieter. But that's not the complete picture. In order to really understand how the guitar works, we have to understand how the string moves the top. So the string can be displaced or moved in several different ways. One, we can move it across, side to side. So if we pull the string straight across, for instance, from one side to the other, it can be put in motion. If we move it only a little way before we release, it produces a quiet dynamic. If we move it a long way before we release, it produces a loud dynamic. However, moving the string side to side doesn't produce as much volume typically, because when the string moves side to side, it's trying to move the top side to side, and that's very difficult to do. The top is more easily moved from top to bottom in this plane. So if possible, it would be better to move the string up and down, which would flex the top to bottom dimension of the top. So pushing the string inward toward the guitar produces a stronger sound with a better fundamental and a generally better sound, most people think. So in order to do that, we actually have to move the string inward. See if I can get a good view of that. Inward toward the guitar. We push it that direction and then pull through at a 45-degree angle. I don't know if you can tell the angle that I'm moving is about 45 degrees across the string. This allows us to push the string inward, pull through, and release. So the top is moving inward. I'll get a good close-up there. Push in, and then which displaces the string. And then we're pulling, so now the string is being pulled somewhat side to side and released. So in order to produce more dynamics, we're trying to push the string further or displace it further. It works better if you can push it inward toward the top as much as possible and go across at a roughly 45-degree angle. Going straight across at a 90-degree angle, this direction here, does also displace the string, as I mentioned earlier, but it's harder for the top to get started moving, and it produces less volume this way and a thinner sound. Now we use that to our advantage in creating different sound colors, but that's a whole nother matter. Versus same amount of energy going into the string, very different sound. Okay, so that's the first part, is the technical part of how to produce dynamics on the instrument. It's displacing the string. The further you displace it, the more energy goes into the top, the more volume you get. And also, if you can get the top moving from the bottom toward the top in this direction, it produces more and better sound than trying to move it side to side. So keep those things in mind as you're working on technique. Then, let's take a look at the three different ways that dynamics are generally applied in music. The first way is graded dynamics. We'll call them graded, for perhaps lack of a better word. We could say the quietest levels. If you look at the handouts that go along with this video in our first exercise, I've given 8 different levels of dynamics, from the quietest level, which is pianissimo, all the way up to molto fortissimo, the loudest level. And so what I think we should be able to do is to produce 8 different dynamic levels in our technique when we're practicing. Now here's the great part about doing this, when you're practicing, you don't have to invent new exercises for this. You can just simply apply dynamics to any exercises you're working on. In the material, the printed material that goes along with this video, I chose a very simple 4-note arpeggio with thumb, index, middle, ring, P-I-M-A arpeggio, as an example. Now, you don't have to use that. You can use whatever you're working on. Let's say, for example, you're working on the Villa-Lobos Etude No. 1. Then you could use that arpeggio as your exercise material, and then you just apply dynamics to it. Or you could do, for instance, the Giuliani studies, a very popular set of studies, and you could apply dynamics to this. So you choose the exercise that you want to apply it to, but I'm going to give you the information to try to apply to that exercise. So let's start with arpeggios. So here's the first exercise. Let's try this together. It's a very simple P-I-M-A arpeggio, and we're going to apply 8 different levels of dynamics. Now, the first time I'll talk you through it, and so you can get a sense of where the dynamic levels are. And what I'm going to do is to move my thumb to the different bass strings. So I'll do P-I-M-A, 6th string first, then 5th string, then 4th string, back to 5th string. That'll be one dynamic level. Then I'll move up a dynamic level, do the same exercise again, and so on. All right, so here's the first exercise. It's a P-I-M-A arpeggio with 8 levels of dynamics. So to begin with, we're going to start with pianissimo, 3 Ps, all right, 3 Ps. Then we'll go to pianissimo, 2 Ps. Then piano. Mezzo piano. Mezzo forte. Forte. Fortissimo. Fortissimo. Now, here they are without talking, so you don't have to hear me interrupt each one of these. So I'll go through all of these in succession without talking. So there's 8 different levels. Okay, so that was exercise number 1. You can apply this again to any arpeggio that you want. Let's say you're doing the Giuliani studies and you want to apply that arpeggio exercise to study number 2, for instance, which is this one here, P-I-M, 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 P-I-M. So you could apply the dynamics to that. It would sound something like this. So you pick the exercise and apply 8 different dynamic levels to it. That's the first exercise. Then the second exercise is to take these 8 different dynamic levels but apply it to a scale now. All right? So you can see what I'm doing with the technique, I think, is I'm applying these 8 different grades of dynamics or levels of dynamic to different types of exercises. And the exercises can be ones you're already doing. They don't have to be anything new. And so in the printed material, I chose a simple C major scale, which can be played in a variety of ways. You could play it in like the first part of the Segovia patterns if you wanted. It could be also played up in this position. Or it could be played, as an open position scale. So it doesn't matter how you play it, But what you want to do is to apply the dynamics to it. So once again, that exercise, if we take the Segovia pattern from those well-known diatonic major and minor scales that we all know and love. So let's try that. Just the first octave of it. You can do 2 octaves, that's fine too. But just for sake of example, I'm going to just cap it at 1 octave. And then for the last note, instead of doing the shift as Segovia would do to play the 2nd octave, I'll just use the little finger to play the highest note. Now I'm going to do all these free strokes. So I'm not switching between free stroke and rest stroke in this particular exercise because they don't. We could do them separately. One is free stroke with the dynamic levels, another is rest stroke. That's kind of a whole nother matter, but let's just try this simple C major scale exercise. So there's my quietest level, pianissimo, and then pianissimo. Piano. Mezzo piano. Mezzo forte. Forte. Fortissimo. Fortissimo. And so what I'm doing each time is trying to increase my dynamic levels. Now I'm just showing you one direction, going from quietest to loudest. You should also go from loudest down to quietest. The point here is that you get really comfortable with different levels of dynamic. I think it's very common for us to think really in terms of 1 or 2 or maybe 3 levels of loud, quiet, and somewhere in between. But I think we need more than that to be really expressive in our playing, and we have to be comfortable with it. If we're not comfortable with it with simple exercises, it's probably not likely we'll be comfortable with it in a more complex piece of music repertoire that we're working on. Okay, so that was the first main idea with dynamics, was 8 different graded levels of dynamic. The second idea is a gradual change in dynamic from quiet to loud and back down, or crescendo and diminuendo, as you've no doubt heard already. If we took those same simple exercises, arpeggios and scales, it would sound something like this. So let's start with an arpeggio, and what we want to do is to apply a crescendo to it first. So just starting quietly and getting gradually louder. Then we can do the opposite. We can start loud and get quiet. And we can combine the 2, crescendo and diminuendo. And so on. Now we can also apply that to scales. So the same idea, very easily applied to scale patterns. So we can take our same C major scale pattern, maybe I'll move it up here just for sake of variety. So we can start quiet, get louder as we go along. And this is one actually, it's a little easier to do 2 octaves. So let me try that once here. This is the Segovia scale pattern. You can also do them as positional scales. Rock and jazz players tend to play them more as positional scales. So I started quiet and got loud. And then you can do the opposite, coming down, getting quieter as you go down. So again, the idea is to apply dynamics to the techniques you're already working on. So scales and arpeggios are really only 2 things. There's so many other techniques you could apply this to. You could apply it to tremolo. So for instance, so you could apply it to that, anything really. But anyway, our second topic, to recap that one, the second topic was gradual crescendo and diminuendo. So getting louder, getting quieter, and you should also practice the opposite, getting quieter, getting louder. So you want to explore those topics in your technique, and you pick the exercise and you apply it. And just a few minutes a day is really good enough, I think, to keep it at the tip of our mind. So when we go to play a piece of music, we're comfortable with dynamics, and we tend to be more expressive as players that way. Which brings us to our third topic, in dynamics, and that is a subito or sudden change in dynamics. So suddenly loud or suddenly quiet. And you can once again apply them to these very simple exercises, arpeggios and scales. So let's take this P-I-M-A arpeggio once again, our favorite arpeggio, and apply that sudden change in dynamics. So if we started out quietly, and so on. So what I did there was to go loud to soft very suddenly. So subito, it feels very different because the physical act of pushing the string a long way and displacing it a long way is physically very different than playing quietly and hardly displacing the string. So getting used to the sudden change of those is also important for us. You don't see that quite as often in music as you do crescendo and graded dynamics, but it's one that we need to practice. So practice that with scales, with your arpeggios and so on. So you can also apply it to a scale. So use that in all of its different guises, and it will help to make you a more expressive player. So again, this isn't really adding much to your technique. You're hopefully already practicing scales, arpeggios, and tremolo, and slurs, and all kinds of other things. Just once in a while, apply some dynamics to them, and really these three topics that you need to work on: the graded dynamics, the gradual dynamics, crescendo, diminuendo, and the subito or sudden changes in dynamics. Once you cover those, that's mostly what we do with dynamics on our instrument. And that's really putting it, isolating it from all the other techniques. So it's not changing timbre as you go along or something like that. It's not combining several different techniques. It's really just one thing to look at. And I think that's sometimes the best way to explore a different technique. Anyway, I hope that this was helpful for you in this series, and I hope that you'll tune in next time as well and join us as we explore this instrument. And we'd love to hear your feedback, so if you have ideas to share with me, I'd love to hear about them. If you have different topics you would like me to explore, please let me know, and I will do my best to get those to you as well. All right, until next time, carry on, do good work. We'll see you soon.